So today I'm going to get into the criticism of the Bible that it condones rape, genocide, and slavery. This is actually not true, but let's get into the reasons why. So the first thing is rape. There is a chapter and a verse where it says that a woman who has sex with a man is to be married to him forever and not be able to be divorced, or her father is to be given 500 shekels. And the first thing I want to say is this word here for rape means to grasp hold of, and this same word can mean to be like to grasp hold of a sword or to grasp hold of a staff, or it just means to grasp hold of. So basically, this is that gray area in a sexual encounter where it might be sexual coercion. It's not necessarily rape, but it's sexual coercion, as in the woman felt pressured to have sex and she did. And in this case, it is a consensual component to it, but it's still a gray area. It also has to do with premarital sex, because in the old Mesopotamian times, there was something called the bride price. You can see this in the laws of Hammurabi and also the Lipid Ishtar. If someone had sex with a woman outside of marriage, that woman would have two options: either to become a whore or to basically become married to the man. And this was the bride price in Mesopotamian culture. This is not actually about rape, but is about consensual sex before the contract of marriage. In the instance where someone is engaged or they're married, the person has sex outside of that covenant, they are to be killed. This is true. But if a person is not married and they are raped, the Bible is quite clear. A person who takes a person by force, like taking a city, that person is to be put to death, no matter what. The Bible kind of implies this using different language. If someone is not married, if they are taken by force, they are to be put to death. So forth, if someone's married or engaged and they have sex, it's unconsensual. Not a gray area, but the woman, she definitely did not want it, and she was forced upon her. She is not to be put to death, and the man is. So in the case of genocide and war, this is what war looks like. The Bible has some strong words about the Canaanites being destroyed, and it's kind of a nuanced topic because sometimes war is necessary. If a culture gets too out of hand and it's too gross in its moral habits, sometimes it needs to be destroyed. Otherwise, it'll perpetuate those sorrows to the other civilizations, and it'll export its culture to other places and make them have miserable lives too. And this is just the way it is. Sometimes you have to, when you go to war, even on modern battlefields, Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas, every modern battlefield, this is what happens. There's men, women, children, old, young, they die, they get killed, cities get destroyed. I mean, we dropped 2 atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We morale bombed Munich. This is something the Allies did, and of course, just they're the good guys and they're doing these same things. So I just think we have to understand, when the Bible makes allowances for these things, it's because that actually happens in war, and it's so that way the person, the soldier who does kill a child on the battlefield, whether incidentally through like a predator drone strike or not, even with like an AR-15 or something like that, they don't feel ashamed for it, because that's just the reality of war. And if we understand that, I think if we understand this is what war is, essentially war is the destruction of another civilization, we won't wage them unless there's a good reason. And finally, with slavery is a very difficult concept, but basically it was a voluntary concept in the Bible. The slave did not have to be a slave. They could leave their owner at any time, and they were supposed to be able to get respite wherever they went. There's a scripture verse about that. You can look it up. It says verbatim that if a slave leaves his master and he comes into your land, you are to let him stay with you, and you are not to oppress him, and you're not to give him back. And because slavery was a voluntary contract, you look in Hebrew culture, so there was an idea in the ancient culture of the logos, that the person who had logos wasn't a slave. They could understand and they could construct a life for themselves, whereas the slave, they had no reasoning capability, so they had to basically be under someone else's tutelage, and they basically had to work, because if people didn't work back then, they didn't have heavy machinery. So if people didn't work back in those days, it could mean starvation for the entire culture. This is why people had to work. This is why some people were owned, because there was no way to pay them with money. Like, there was no paper currency, and gold was very scarce, and so was copper, and so was bronze, and so was silver. So the only thing they had to pay them with was food and clothing and shelter, and that's generally what happened, is that these people were like serfs. They they'd be sold off to different feudal lords, like territorial lords, and this is what had to happen, otherwise people would have starved. This is just how society was organized back then. It wasn't like chattel slavery was, where it was like racially motivated, and you being of a different race, you were automatically considered inferior. And it wasn't like really brutal. Like there's a lot of literature in Hebrew culture of treating the slave nicely because your life depends on them and their life depends on you. It's a symbiotic relationship, and they're your brother, and you're to treat them with respect and kindness. And this is just a part of Jewish culture, is that yes, there was like verses about if you wound the slave, if they live a day and they die, he's your property. Yes, that is in the scripture, but you have to take it into context that, if the master was that brutal, it'd be better for the slave to die. And also, if the master killed the slave on the first day, then the slave is dead, the master is guilty. So if a master is that brutal, and also it says if a slave loses an eye or an arm, he is to be set free. So the idea here is not that this was something that was forced upon someone. Yes, there was forms of torture for getting a slave to basically work, but it wasn't this brutal thing that was chattel slavery, because chattel slavery was an evil, and this is one of the reasons why the abolitionists thought that it was so cruel and they wanted to get rid of it, and they used Christianity as a means to do so, because chattel slavery was not right, and it was also coming on the edge of the Industrial Revolution. They didn't really need slaves anymore, so they had a reason to get rid of them. But in the time of Mesopotamia and Egypt and all these old ancient cultures, they needed slaves to survive because someone needed to do the work, and they didn't have machines to do it. They didn't even have simple machines to do the work. They had blades and stuff like that, and if no one was doing the work, everyone would starve. So it's a sucky part of the world, but luckily we don't have to do that anymore because we have machines and stuff like that, and we also have currencies, and we have lots of things that make slavery obsolete. So it's not that back then they were cruel. It's just back then people needed to eat, and if people weren't working, no one could eat. And the last context for slavery was a war prisoner or something like that, which the war prisoner was basically of a different culture. And you have to understand that the people that the Jews were to take prisoners from and make them slaves, these people were cannibals, pedophiles, rapists, murderers. They had sex with children. These people were not good people. So when the Jews enslaved them, it was a mercy. And even they had the right to leave their master and go live with someone else. And also, if they wanted to, they could adopt Jewish law like Ruth did and be fully grafted into the Israelite nation, and then they couldn't be enslaved. So again, it's just the fact of the matter is that if you wanted to be not a slave in Jewish culture, you had to follow the Jewish laws, because the idea of slavery was that it was a punishment too. Kind of like a work release program that we still have today. And that's the 3 tough topics.